Alright, now let's test our code and make sure that the user is remembered if they check the Remember Me box while logging in. Okay, so let's log in. And check the Remember Me box. Okay, so I'm going to log in now. So we are redirected to the notes page. Okay, now we're logged in. Now let's check the Remember Me table and make sure that we've got a record added to the table, which means that we're going to be remembered for the next time we try to log in. Okay, so let's click on the Remember Me table and see how many records we've got there. So we've got one record there. We can see our first random variable and the second one, okay, hashed, okay, and we can see the expiry date and time there. All right, so our code is working fine. Now, when the user comes back to the website, given that they haven't logged out, okay, and that their session has been destroyed, then they should be remembered if they check the Remember Me box while logging in, okay? So first, we're going to go to the top of our index.php file, which is our homepage, and we're going to write some PHP code there, okay, saying if the user is remembered, then they're going to be logged in, okay? So first, we're going to need to start a session, okay? Using the session start function. Okay, also, we're going to connect to the database as we're going to be running some queries later on. Okay, so we're just going to include our connection file for that. Okay, then we're going to write our Remember Me code. Okay, so to keep our code tidy, okay, and easy to read, we're going to place our code inside our Remember Me file, okay, which we created there. So we're just going to refer to that file using the include function. Okay, so let's save. The file is called remember.php. Okay, so now let's go to the file and start writing our code there. I'm just going to pause and tidy up these comments quickly as they look like HTML comments for now. Okay. Okay, that looks better. So the first thing we're going to do is to check that the user is not logged in, okay, and also that they have a cookie on their device, okay, a Remember Me cookie. So to do this, I'm going to use an if statement. Okay, so the condition we're looking for first is that the user is logged in, and we can check that by looking at the session variable, okay, or the session array. So we're going to check the elements corresponding to the user ID, for example, in our session array. So we're going to check that the element user ID inside our session array does not exist or is not set. Okay, so to do this, we can use the function isSet. Okay, and we're going to use the opposite of the result. Okay, there is also another way of doing this. If you're working with an array, there is a function called array underscore key exists. Okay, so this function takes a couple of parameters. So the first one is the key element that you're looking for, in our case, user ID. And the second parameter is the array, okay, which is our session array. Okay, you can use that function as well. Okay. Now we're also checking that the Remember Me cookie exists. Okay, so we're just going to check that the cookie is not empty. Okay, so we're going to use the opposite of the empty function, like that. And the parameter of the function is going to be the element in the cookie array, okay, corresponding to the key remember me. Okay. Now, if these conditions are fulfilled, then we know that the user is remembered, and we know that there is a cookie, okay, and also we know that we stored variables in the remember me table. So if we go back to our login file and look at the functions we used for the cookie and for storing the variables in the table, okay, so you've got function f1, okay, which is the concatenation of the first variable and the second variable while we're converting the second variable from binary to hexadecimal. Okay, so let's just copy that and keep it as a comment to make our understanding easier. Okay, so that's the cookie. And when we stored the variables in the table, we used function f2, which hashes the second variable using SHA-256. Okay, so that's f1 and that's f2. Now, the first thing we're going to do is to extract the variables 1 and 2 from the cookie. Okay, so that's the first step. Then later on, we're going to compare the values we get from the cookie with the ones that we've got in our remember me table. Okay, so now to extract the two authentificators from the cookie, the first thing we're going to do is divide the cookie to 2 bits. The bit that is on the left hand side of the comma and the other bit which is on the right hand side of the comma. Okay, and then that will give us authenticator 2, authenticator 1, but it's going to give us authenticator 2 in hexadecimal. And then we're going to convert that to binary, okay, so that we can get the original variable. Okay, so let's go ahead and do this. So to divide our cookie, we're going to use a function called explode. Okay, so this function is going to take a couple of parameters. So the first parameter is going to be the criteria we're going to use in order to divide the cookie. In our case, we're going to use the comma criteria. Okay, and then we're going to give our function the value of the cookie itself. Okay, so this function explode is going to return an array of strings. So it took 2 parameters, the delimiter or our criteria, the comma there, and our string, and it's going to return an array of strings. Okay, now we need to store the values inside this array, inside our variables authenticator 1 and authenticator 2. So to do this, we're going to use another function called list. Okay, so this function is going to take a couple of parameters, in our case authenticator 1 and 2. Okay, and it's going to assign the values returned inside the array, okay, that we get using the function explode. It's going to assign those values to authenticator 1 and authenticator 2. Okay, all right, Now, the only problem we have is that authenticated 2, we're going to get it in hexadecimal. Okay, now we're going to need to turn it to binary. So we're just going to use the function hexadecimal to binary, okay, of the variable itself. And now we've got exactly the original authentificators that we created in the login file. Okay. Now we're going to go to the remember me table and match these values that we've got for our two variables with whatever we stored in there. Okay. So if you remember, authenticator 1 was stored as it is, but we stored f2 of authenticator 2 in this column. Okay. So what we're going to do, we're going to create another variable f2 of authenticator 2, okay, which is f2 of authenticator 2, but instead of defining the function again, we can just use the formula straight away, okay, which is just the hash of authenticator 2. All right. Now, the first thing we're going to do is find a record in our table, okay, where the authenticator 1 column matches our first variable, okay. So let's write our query. So you're going to select the records from our table, remember me, okay, where the first column okay matches the value of our first variable authenticator 1. Okay, now we're going to run the query and store the results in the results variable. So to run the query using the function MySQLi query, again it takes a couple of parameters, our link variable and our query. All right. Now we're going to check if the query has been successful. Okay, has been run successfully. So we're going to check the opposite of the result variable. So if the query is not successful, result is going to be returning a Boolean false, and the opposite of it is going to be true. So if that's the case, we're going to echo an error message. Okay, so let's copy the error message from somewhere. Okay, and write some text in there. So we're going to say something like, there was an error running the query. Okay, now if the query is successful, we're going to write some other code. So we're expecting one record only in the results object, and we're going to need to check that. Okay, so we can use the same code we used in the login file. Okay, and instead of using the else statement, you can use the exit keyword, okay, or function, and then write some code after the if statement. Okay, so we're defining a variable count where we're storing the number of records in the results object. Okay, and if count is different than 1, then we're going to echo an error. Okay, so let's say something like, remember me process failed. Okay, something like this. Okay, and then we're going to fetch the record inside the results object. Okay, so we're going to define a variable row. Okay, and before we do that, let's just exit here as well. Okay, so we're going to check that. If there is an error, we're going to exit the whole code here. Okay, we're not going to continue. We're going to check that as well, and then we're going to exit if the count is different than 1. And then if everything is fine, we're going to define this variable row, where we're going to store the record, okay, that we've got inside the results object. So we're going to use the function mysqli fetch array. Okay, that's we used before. So this function again takes a couple of parameters. So the first one is going to be our result object. The second one is optional, and we're going to use it to have an associative array. Okay, so you can either go for numeric or associative. So we're going to go for associative. You can go for both as well if you want. Okay, so now we are going to compare the value we find in the F2 authenticator2 column with the value of the variable F2 authenticator2 that we created earlier. Okay, so if those two values match, okay, then we're going to allow the user to log in. Okay, we're going to log them in. So far we have covered this step, which is looking for the first variable. Okay, we've done that one. Now we're going to do this one. Okay. So we're going to have an if statement. So when comparing two hashes, there is a function you can use. It's called hash equals, like this. Okay. So it's going to take a couple of parameters. Okay. So the first one is going to be the element of key F2 authenticator2 in our record. Okay, so we've got one record there, and we're gonna look at that element of key F2 authenticator2. Okay, so it's going to be row, and then the index we're looking at is, or the key is F2 authenticator2. Okay, then the second value or parameter is going to be our variable as we created earlier, F2 authenticator2. Okay, so if these two values are equal, the function hash equals is going to return true. Okay, so if that's the case, we're going to log the user in by setting their session variables. Okay, so you're going to set the element of key user ID. Okay, and the user ID can be found in the record, okay, that we've got there, by using the ID column. So that's going to be the element in our row array, okay, of key ID of the user, and actually that's the column user ID that we've got there. That's the ID of our user, okay, in the remember me table. That's right there. Okay, so here we go. So user ID. All right, now we logged our user in, but before we redirect them to the notes page, we're going to regenerate new authentificators and store them in a cookie and in the remember me table, which we'll do in the next video.